Hello everyone, and I'm very glad to be back at Gresham College. And today I'm going to speak about one of my favourite subjects, the Italian Renaissance. I'm going to focus on Giotto and the early Italian Renaissance. But first I want to provide an overview. I'm going to talk a little bit first about the purpose of art history, the historical context, economic, political, religious and intellectual life and changes in the period. The stylistic cross-currents that were present in Italy in the late 13th and early 14th century, Byzantine, Romanesque, Gothic, Classical. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about specific architects and sculptors, specifically Cimabue, the Roman school, Assisi and the Florence. So first I'd like to talk a bit about the purpose of art history. And I think, generally speaking, it's important to think of art history in terms of teaching us not only how to look, but also to see what is in a painting or an artwork. It helps us understand the creative expressions of the past and to appreciate them, and provides knowledge about the art of different cultures, the different currents and influences, and also the changes in content, style, form, images, and symbols. And in this way, I think a study of art history can help enrich our own thinking and ideas. So the Renaissance in Italy, I think we've got the general idea of the atmosphere of the Italian Renaissance and the way this was in fact reflected in art and architecture. To begin with, there was a lot of influence from the Byzantine period. And so we'll look at some artworks from early Italo-Byzantine examples, up to about 1400. And I'm going to be using well-known examples. Some of them will be in London in the National Gallery or the Victoria and Albert Museum, for example, or in well-known places on the continent like the Uffizi or the Louvre, which hopefully we'll all be able to visit again soon. I want to consider how the spirit of the age reflects the art and architecture, leading on into the Quattrocento and the High Renaissance. So, olive groves and cypress trees, rulers, republics, peasants and popes, plottings and poisonings, pageants and festivals, magnificent palaces and highly painted churches. The Medici, Michelangelo, Machiavelli. This sort of sums up the concept of the Italian Renaissance, which I've set here against the background of one of the very earliest landscapes in European art, the landscape by Lorenzetti in Siena, showing the countryside and the olive groves and cypress trees. It's important, I think, to know a bit about the history of the period. So we're going to look first at the way in which Italy, or what is now known as Italy, was then a collection of city-states and republics, and also very much ruled by the popes. But it was a period of exceptional growth and change, economically, politically, and culturally, but especially intellectually, where rational inquiry was beginning to replace the theology of the Middle Ages. There were also changes socially and in the different forms of patronage. And here we can see on the map the way that Florence was, and Siena and the Papal States were all different republics, quite often fortified hill towns like Siena, or larger conglomerations like Rome and Florence. The changes in religion were important at the time, and chapels and patrons. Of course, the church had been the main patron of art during the Middle Ages, and you can see on the left the way that the patron, Scrovegni, is donating his chapel to the church. The Last Judgment is quite traditional, but here at the bottom, here is Scrovegni donating the church. So although we have a private patrons coming in the early Renaissance, the motivation is still religious because the chapel was donated for the salvation of his soul, as well as for the glorification of the city-state of Padua. So the different influences and stylistic cross-currents can be mainly separated into, as I mentioned, the change in religious and philosophical thought. Then we have different stylistic influences: Byzantine, Romanesque, Gothic. So let's look first at Byzantine art, just very briefly. This is the sort of thing that was happening in 11th century Greece. And according to Vasari, who wrote the lives, the first real art historian, who wrote the lives of the artists in 1568, he regarded Byzantine art as a clumsy, awkward style that was crude and stiff and mediocre. In fact, it's very sophisticated, these gold backgrounds, much more spiritual approach, almost an abstract expressionist approach. And Vasari criticized it because it wasn't a naturalistic background. He regarded history as a history of art as the development of art towards the more natural, the more realistic, the better, in Vasari's view, culminating with Michelangelo. But in fact, the Byzantine art should not be criticized for not doing what it was not trying to do. And it's actually very sophisticated, almost like a form of abstract expressionism. You wouldn't criticize Picasso for not making his figures realistic in the same way as in Byzantine art. But it was a huge influence in Italy. For example, if we look at the work of Guido da Siena, and there is a nativity here to compare on the left, we can see that in the 12th century in Siena, there was still a great deal of influence of Byzantine art. This led to what's called the Italo-Byzantine style, and a very good example of this is in the National Gallery in London. Dated 1262, it's actually the oldest work in the National Gallery, by Margherita di Arezzo, The Virgin and Child Enthroned with Narrative Scenes. So you can see that there is a lot of Byzantine influence there in the different scenes that are depicted, the sort of stylistic manner of it. The Christ child is depicted as a mannequin rather than a baby, because there's not the will there to depict the deity as a helpless baby in a realistic way. In addition to the Byzantine, there's also Celtic, Northern Romanesque influence. So here, for example, in Coppo di Marcavaldo's Last Judgment in the Baptistry in Florence from the mid-13th century, we can see we've still got these Byzantine gold backgrounds, and the Christ is depicted on a very diagrammatic arc-en-ciel, or the rather cosmic depictions of seated on the heavens. So there's still this influence here. There's also quite a lot of Gothic influence coming down from the north, and here's another illustration by Guido da Siena. I showed the nativity in the top right-hand corner a little earlier. And again, you can see here that there's a very stylistic approach, very stylized approach. St. Peter is sitting on the throne, and there's an attempt to depict the space here, a realization that as you look at architectural or sculptural matter, then the orthogonals, these diagonal lines here, recede into the distance at an angle. But of course, they're receding outwards or in a rather haphazard way. It's not until the Renaissance proper that linear perspective was mastered in order to create realistic space. Another influence is actually Roman influence, Romanesque arches. This is I'll just mention an architectural example here, San Miniato al Monte, which is on the hill overlooking Florence, where we've got this Romanesque approach. And in fact, the baptistry in Florence, which you can see here, was so Roman in its style, it was actually thought to be classical and ancient until very much later, when it was realized that it was actually 11th century. So another big change at the beginning of the 13th century, St. Francis of Assisi died in 1226. He was canonized in 1228, and almost immediately, and had a huge influence on religion, which took on a much more personalized and humanized approach as he, for example, invented the idea of the Christmas crib. He depicted Christ and spoke about Christ as as a more humane figure rather than a remote and awesome deity as in the Byzantine Pantocrator. And here is a picture of Assisi where this massive church was built, and the whole church is covered in frescoes. The upper church tends to have the earlier frescoes by different masters, not always identified. The master of the St. Francis cycle, sometimes identified as Giotto, but sometimes just noted as the master of the St. Francis cycle. And in the lower church, there are some later works, particularly by those from the Sienese school. So immediately in the lower basilica, we've got an example by Cimabue, and you can see that his depiction of St. Francis, I put in different versions here because the colouring varies slightly on some of these reproductions, but you can see here, as St. Francis is depicted on the right, that he's actually much more humanely depicted, and also the form and shape of him is much more realistic and lifelike. There's an attempt here to depict a three-dimensional space, the Madonna's throne, and then put three-dimensional figures into that three-dimensional space, which is really key to the early Renaissance works. Cimabue's Santa Trinità Madonna of 1280 is shown here, and again the Byzantine Gothic influence is still there, but it does have this much more humane approach. The Christ child becomes more baby-like, and the modelling of figures in form is more important. Now, Cimabue was really famous in his own time, and Dante actually mentioned him in his Purgatory, said that once Cimabue thought to hold the field, and Giotto's all the rage today. So Giotto came to replace Cimabue. Cimabue's crucifixion at Assisi from 1280 shows again this more humane person where you've got the feeling of a figure, although it's in bad condition, you've got the feeling of a figure really hanging on the cross as the women below stretch out their arms, expressing their emotion about this event. This could be compared with his some later works of Christ on the cross, which is much more realistically depicted and shadowed, more like a human figure, and compared again with his Virgin and the Child on the left, which is a very small work. So if we compare the fresco I just mentioned with Christ on the cross, then we can see that this is really a developing approach to a more realistic depiction of the suffering Christ on the cross. Now, similar things were happening in Rome, and we know that Giotto went to Rome, and for example here, Cavallini's Last Judgment in Santa Maria in Trastevere, it looks as if it really is getting some influence from the Roman art and artifacts that still existed at the time, as the seated figures of the apostles surrounding Christ are almost depicted in Roman togas. As I said, we know that Giotto went to Rome and this might have influenced him. But if you look at the light and the shade and the modelling, we can see that this different approach is becoming apparent in Italy. So following the earlier works, we can now look at Giotto and Assisi. On the left, we have an illustration of fresco by Giotto from the Arena Chapel in Padua, but there's more controversy about the frescoes at Assisi, which are generally accepted to be by Giotto, but sometimes described as being by the master of the St. Francis cycle. Giotto actually became his apprentice. As Vasari tells us, one day Cimabue was on his travelling back from Florence, and he came across the young Giotto, who was sketching a sheep on a rock with a stick before he'd received any instructions. So Cimabue took Giotto under his wing, and he became apprenticed. Now, if we look at the frescoes at Assisi, we can see that there is a very different approach by Giotto, or the Master of the St. Francis cycle. So if we look at an earlier altarpiece by Berlinghieri, St. Francis's Sermon to the Birds of the earlier 13th century, you can see here that the priests are standing in a line on a sort of shelf. There's an attempt to depict space in the architectural building behind them, and also the birds and the hillsides, but it's all very stylized, more in the Italo-Byzantine or medieval manner. And we can compare this immediately with the Master of the St. Francis cycle, or Giotto's frescoes of the 1290s. You can see here that there is a far more naturalistic approach. The artist has really looked at the world around him in the spirit of St. Francis's preaching, looking at the world as the work of God, depicting the monks in three-dimensional volume, with gestures and expressions on their faces as they look at the birds, which are also very naturalistically depicted and identifiable. The trees too, and the suggestion of the landscape is very evident here as well. Some later examples show St. Francis sharing his cloak on the left, where we have again some architectural images in the background. And you can see here, if we look at this one, the orthogonals receding, showing acute observation of naturalism and how buildings really work in perspective. And again, the buildings on the right here, as St. Francis renounces his worldly goods. The perspective doesn't quite ring true. The orthogonals are a bit haphazard as they recede into space. And we've still got a frieze-like approach to the figures, but they are, however, very monumentally modelled in light and shade, with the different expressions and gestures of the people as they look at St. Francis. Another example from Assisi is the Master of the Isaac cycle in the upper church from the 1290s. And this is because the name is because he was the responsible for painting the Isaac cycle, and it has been the story here of Isaac and his sons. And it has been surmised that perhaps this too was a young Giotto, or possibly Cavallini, who I mentioned as being active in Rome. Just to get it straight about perspective before we move on, here's a modern diagram of how linear perspective actually works, that when you have the orthogonals meeting at a single vanishing point in the distance, and this is the way to make the architectural space really ring true. Or it can apply to things like trees, which diminish in size as they recede. And this contrasts in the Renaissance with the medieval idea of trying to get a feeling of distance by placing things higher up the picture space or behind one another. But this, of course, didn't really come to fruition until the Quattrocento in the 15th century. So the next example is something that is very securely documented as being by Giotto, the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, also known as the Arena Chapel because it was on the site of an ancient arena. This dates from about 1304 to 13. And Vasari really claims here that it was actually Giotto alone who, by God's favour, rescued and restored art. And you can see here the series of frescoes running around the chapel, almost like a story. I've included the slide on the left with a few people to show actually the size and scale of this. And also we have the Last Judgment on the end wall. So this is what Giotto is depicting here in a very traditional layered format. But his series of frescoes showing the story of Christ and his ancestors round the chapel is really quite remarkable. For example, here we have the depiction of Joachim and the shepherds. That is the father of the Virgin Mary, who was expelled for being childless. And you can sense his emotions here. The emotions are coming through much more clearly than in earlier works, as he bows his head before the shepherds. The body is very, very monumental and sturdy. The Adoration of the Magi, again, is another example of Giotto's style in Padua. And as I mentioned, he's taking a more scientific approach as well, looking at things like birds, naturalism, and so on. And here, what is particularly noteworthy is the depiction of a comet here, standing in for the Star of Bethlehem. And we do know that Halley's Comet was arrived in 1301. And so he seems to have depicted this comet that would have received a lot of attention at the time. The camels are quite fun, with a sort of almost a smiling expression, and the same smile seems to come through in the donkey, where Mary is depicted as the flight to Egypt. So we've got, again, a real sense of space, the way the figure's feet are placed sturdily on the ground, in contrast to medieval sort of pointed tiptoes. And the background or landscape is also very solid, whilst the angel still has a very ethereal medieval flavour to it. In the cycle about Christ's life, one of the particularly dramatic frescoes is of Christ being betrayed by Judas as he bends to kiss him. And you can see the drama of the moment. And what is very strange here is the rear view of a figure on the left, which almost seems to be like the viewer being brought into the picture. Rear views were unknown in medieval and Byzantine art. The lamentation over the dead Christ is also a particularly dramatic example by Giotto. And you can see how the landscape, this cliff draws the eye towards the dead Christ. Again, we have rear views of figures, almost as if the viewer is sitting as part of the circle around the dead Christ. And the gestures and expressions, the emotions of the characters, the shock and horror of the people below, and reflected in the feelings of the angels above, is very evident. And Giotto was very famed for this in his own time. On the lower registers in the chapel, there are some what are called grisaille paintings, made to look rather like stone. And this choice of subject here is interesting, because on the left we have caritas, or charity, or love, and actually holding a heart. This is one of the earliest images of a heart in art. Which seems to be gaining the symbolic shape that it now has. But also he depicts particularly more secular subjects, like justice on the right-hand side, who is depicted in a very solid way, in a very solid niche, showing the secularity and drawing away from purely theological subjects. Giotto's Ognissanti Madonna is also a slightly later example, but postdates the Scrovegni chapel, dated to about 1310. And you can see here that the way the angels are kneeling in a real space, the Madonna is enthroned. Giotto has created a three-dimensional space, making the orthogonals recede here and here, to give a real sense of space of where the Madonna is seated, surrounded by the angels with halos, yet it still has a very gold background. The Madonna is very robust indeed, and the Christ child is very securely seated on her lap. To sum up Giotto, we can see that at this time in the proto-Renaissance, there are all these different trades and stylistic themes, from Byzantine, Romanesque, Gothic, and even Far Eastern, all coming into play to develop this new art form of the early Renaissance. Giotto's late works are important. I'm afraid we don't have to go into detail here about the frescoes at Santa Croce in Florence. These are in the Bardi in the Peruzzi Chapel, showing the lives of St. Francis and St. John the Evangelist and St. John the Baptist. On the right, you can see that these later works, they're actually not in such good condition as the Arena Chapel or Assisi, because some of them, as you can see here, they'd had altarpieces built over them. In later life, he became capamaestro of the Duomo, the cathedral in Florence, and was also an architect. He designed the campanile, which is still standing. So now I'd like to look at the Sienese school. And it's important to remember that the Sienese school was rather distinctive and different, although occurring at the same time as the works at Assisi, Giotto's works, or Cavallini in Rome. And there was quite a lot of interchange between these artists, who also, for example, the Sienese artists did work at Assisi, which wasn't that far away. The main artists I'd like to mention are Guido da Siena, who I've already spoken about, who was quite influenced by the medieval and Italo-Byzantine styles. But then the main ones are really Duccio di Buoninsegna, Simone Martini, and the brothers Pietro and Ambrogio Lorenzetti, Pietro probably being the older of the two. Now, between them, these artists actually developed a rather distinctive and different Sienese style, which was much more lyrical compared with the emphasis on volume and solidity of Giotto works at Assisi in the Roman school. The Sienese tended to emphasize line more than volume, which led to a rather lyrical as opposed to a monumental approach. So we can start by looking at Duccio's Maestà of 1308, and this is the main panel of the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child, with all the saints, angels, contemporary figures and bishops and so on arranged around her. You can see that there's some attempt to give a solidity of form to the throne, which Mary, modelled in light and shade, as are the other figures, is very firmly seated on this. So there's still some Italo-Byzantine influence here, especially with the gold backgrounds and halos. The medieval idea of identifying the saints like St. John the Baptist here and depicting them in the normal way is also evident. But there is a new tenderness in the depiction of the Virgin and Child. Now this, as I mentioned, was the main panel of what is an incredibly large altarpiece. Now the altarpiece was at the Duomo in Siena was dispersed in the 18th century. Some of the panels remain, some have been lost. And the slide here shows an impression of what it would have looked like when all the panels were together. So we have the main panel of the Virgin in Majesty here. Across the top, there's the story of the Annunciation to Mary, and also her life, her death, the Dormition of the Virgin, her ascent to heaven. And then along the bottom, we have the Annunciation and Nativity again. And when this was made, it is very, very large. It processed through Siena. And although Siena, like Florence, was incredibly rich, again, like Florence, based on banking, trade, the cloth trade, and so on, there were problems. There was plague, there were enemies. And so the idea was that this Maestà, the altarpiece of the Virgin in Majesty, would protect them from all of this. And of course, also the origin of altarpieces at this time, there was actually a papal decree in 1310 that altarpieces were made for each church. And this gave individual artists much more leeway to create separate artifacts. Now, the back of the Maestar, again, we have a reproduction here of what it would look like. It shows many, many more scenes. And here we have the story of Christ. And you can see Christ's mission and the fisherman and the Last Supper, and eventually the passion and crucifixion of Christ. A particularly notable scene on the bottom left-hand corner is Christ's entry into Jerusalem. And here we can see the architecture is depicted in a three-dimensional way, with the orthogonals receding as a sort of a proto use of one-point perspective. So we've got also the distance, however, is created by putting figures higher up the scene. Although here, unusually, the larger figures are in the background, signifying their importance, rather than having the smaller figures in the background. So there's something not quite right here, but it's getting towards what Vasari would call the rebirth or renaissance, rinascita in Italian, of art. Christ enters in with his halo and the riding on a naturalistic looking donkey, and a nice touch is the figures here up in the trees, craning to see Christ. As I mentioned, the altarpiece, the Maestar, was dispersed and broken up, and happily perhaps for us, there are 3 panels in the National Gallery in London. We have the Annunciation and the Healing of the Man Born Blind, are 2 examples, which I've picked out to show you from these examples in London, how the linearity of the Sienese school, with this sort of medieval Gothic gold, persists longer than in the frescoes of Giotto and Assisi. And here on the right, the Healing of the Man Born Blind, there's again a slightly medieval approach where we've got the same figure depicted twice. So we've got 2 scenes for the price of one, as it were, where the man is healed and then able to see. But the architectural designs at the back are really showing a different approach to the settings of these historic and theological scenes. Duccio was particularly famous for his large Madonna, the Rucellai Madonna of 1285. And again, the Virgin Mary is seated very robustly on the throne. But see how the linearity comes through as we can trace the edge of her gown and veil in a way that was so popular in the Sienese school, but less so elsewhere in Italy. Blue was normally reserved for the Virgin's mantle because it was made from lapis lazuli, which was one of the most expensive materials from which pigments are made. Again, the angels are depicted around the throne, and the ones at the bottom are very firmly placed in actual space, although the others seem to be floating aloft rather. Again, there is an example of a Duccio altarpiece in the National Gallery in London, dated from about 1300. And we can see here there's an increased tenderness in the Virgin's relationship with the Christ child, who is still, however, shown somebody somewhat like a mannequin or a miniature person or deity, rather than a chubby baby. Now, Duccio was married, he had many children, so he knew what a baby looked like, but we've still got this slightly austere approach to the depiction. And again, we've got the gold backgrounds typical of the medieval period, or also having some Gothic influence. Now, just to compare, I've just talked about Duccio's Madonna in the centre. We previously saw Cimabue's Madonna on the left and Giotto's on the right. And I think it's quite interesting to compare the 3 great Madonnas by these 3 great early Renaissance artists, looking at the way that Cimabue started to break up this more strict, stylized approach to the depiction of the Virgin with more space and modelling of form. Then we have Duccio's Rucellai Madonna in the Sienese style, which is more linear. And then on the right, we have Giotto's Ognissanti Madonna of 1300 or so, where it is really monumental and volumetric in the way that the figures are depicted. What is particularly remarkable about these altarpieces is their enormous size. They are housed in the Uffizi in one of the galleries, and you can see here, especially on the right from the inclusion of a few figures, how absolutely massive these altarpieces are, about 12 feet high. Now ended up in the museum, of course, rather than being in situ as intended. Another well-known artist of the Sienese school is Simone Martini, and he also produced a version of the Maya star in fresco. And here we can see again the sort of the more tapestry-like, the more linear approach of the Sienese school. The canopy under which the Virgin is seated gives a depth to the painting, and we do have a lot of figures here depicted in a naturalistic way, but again with an emphasis on line rather than massive volume, as the Virgin is seated on a throne in the centre. This was a large fresco. And the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, where the Republic, from where the Republic was run, is the site for many of these works that I'm going to be showing. Opposite, for example, in the Palazzo Pubblico, again by Simone Martini, is a very different subject from the Maya Star or Virgin and Child. This is an equestrian portrait of Guido da Fogliano in 1328, where the warrior is depicted against a background of landscape scenes of cities that he'd conquered and a military camp on the right. So we can see here how the subject matter is moving away from not only religious themes, but also secular and republican themes here. But one of the most exquisite of Simone Martini's work is the Annunciation of 1333. Here we've got a combination of the realism and naturalism that's coming into Italy at this time in works of Giotto and at Assisi, where Simone Martini also did some work. But here we've got the Annunciation, where the angel, the fluttering drapery, shows how the angel seems just to arrive, to have sort of almost flown in from the left, and landed while the Virgin has a sort of half attraction, half shrinking away from the angel who is delivering this message that she will be the mother of Christ, the mother of the Son of God. We've got a lot of Gothic influence here in the way the altarpiece is completed by the surrounding work, the pinnacles, Gothic pinnacles, and gold background and gold halos of the figures, and the accompanying saints. As mentioned, the shrinking away, half shrinking, half attracted, rather in awe, as the angel announces to Mary what her role is to be. And the words are actually inscribed here, that she is to be favoured. The Gothic idea I mentioned is also known as Gothic sway, and this is an example of a Gothic sculpture from Reims of, again, a Virgin and Child, but this sort of Gothic sway as she takes the weight of the child on her hip is typical of Gothic of the period, and something that influenced Simone Martini, who actually moved with the popes to Avignon in the 14th century and was therefore quite influenced by the French Gothic. Looking in detail at the angel on the left, the detail of the plants and foliage, as well as the face of the angel and hair, is absolutely exquisite, and one can actually imagine that this is almost something that came to influence Botticelli's works later in the 15th century. To me, it's reminiscent of Botticelli in the approach to the foliage and the flowers and the beautiful angel with the feathered wings. Now, the Lorenzetti brothers, Pietro and Ambrogio, were also very famous in Siena. Pietro Lorenzetti, the older of the two brothers, painted an altarpiece at Santa Maria della Pieve in Arezzo, the Santa Maria of the people, as that indicates. And it's interesting that this altarpiece is actually still in situ in the church for which it was painted, whereas so many of the others have ended up in museums, being too fragile or difficult to remain in place. Another work by Lorenzetti is the Deposition from the Lower Basilica at Assisi. And here you can see how in the deposition of Christ from the cross, the weight of the Christ as he is brought down is very tangible, as well as the emotions of those surrounding him, the mourning of Mary Magdalene kissing the feet and hands of Christ. The background is blank, neither gold nor any indication of landscape, so as to ensure focus on the dead Christ. One particularly rather perhaps gruesome naturalistic touch is the use of a pair of pincers in the centre, slightly towards the right, to remove the nails from Christ's feet. So it's showing a more realistic approach rather than symbolic. And again, the linearity of the Sienese school comes through here. Later on, Pietro Lorenzetti painted the Last Supper in the Lower Basilica at Assisi. And here we can see he's really taken on himself the incredible challenge of trying to depict space in a hexagonal room, which is really difficult to get the perspective right by any accounts. But he gives a fantastic feeling of space in the depiction of the Last Supper and the disciples here, showing some realistic touches with the bread and wine and food on the table. But even more realistic and naturalistic is the scene to the left, where we have the servants preparing and cleaning the dishes, which are licked by a cat and dog, and depicted in a sort of a very homely touch, as against this very severe approach in the stylized, haloed saints and Christ on the right. Another scientific naturalistic approach is the starry sky above, which shows with a couple of comets there and a moon, shows the interest in science and scientific reproduction coming along at the same time as we've got these rather classical figures of angels along the top of the columns. So there are lots of, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, there are lots of stylistic influences that are all come together in this early proto-Renaissance style. Here's the detail of the servants on the left, the fire trying to catch the light of the burning fire and create a realistic scene which contrasts with the incredible immensity of the scene on the right-hand side. Ambrogio Lorenzetti, probably the younger of the two brothers, painted fewer religious themes, but was well known for his frescoes in the very large Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. And here we have his allegory of good and bad government in the Palazzo Pubblico, with a multitude of figures. We've got faith, hope, and charity depicted at the top. And along the bottom, we have justice here with the scales of justice, peace, which is almost the focus of the, in the center of the painting. And she's actually treading on armor and military paraphernalia, followed by fortitude and prudence. The large male figure represents the common good of the commune and republic of Siena, with magnanimity, temperance, and punishing justice on the right. Justice is a major theme because the other figure of justice, the figures of justice begin and end this row, but the decapitated head shows that justice is not afraid to act when necessary. Along the bottom here, we've got the attendees, who are largely identified portraits of Sienese dignitaries. And still, we have a classical motif here, where we have Romulus, Remus, and the wolf depicted as a reference, here you can see in the detail, to ancient Rome. Around the surrounding walls, Virgil Lorenzetti depicts what the effects would be if good government is followed. And here we have good government, the effect of good government in the city, where we've got a fantastic city depicted in one of the, what can really be described as a landscape proper, one of the earliest landscapes being done by the Lorenzetti in Siena at this time. We've got village scenes, markets, animals being taken to market, and peasants, but also dancing girls, and the more senior, more affluent courtiers of the city. His depiction of good government in the countryside, as I showed earlier in this presentation, shows the whole countryside, remembering that Siena is a hilltop town, stretching out above from that beautiful courtyard that I showed a little while ago, stretching out across the hills with the olive trees, the vineyards, the crops. These are all depicted according to the labours of the month, as the peasants work in the villages and surrounding farms and areas, whilst the nobles, I'll show you in a detail here, are out hunting with their dogs. So this is a very realistic snapshot, almost photographic snapshot of a scene in the landscape. And again here, trying to show his prowess at perspective, showing a rear view of a donkey. From the middle of the century, around 1340, we have a group of artworks by the so-called followers of Giotto, or the Giotteschi. On the left, we have Taddeo Gaddi, who again depicts Joachim, this time meeting Anne at the gate. And here you can see that there's definitely some influence of Giotto here, in the monumentality of the figures, the light and shade on the figures to give them a solidity and a feeling of anatomy. But there's also the traditional approach to the architectural background, again coming from Giotto and the Sienese school, but a very homely touch in the figure on the left, who appears to be taking a lamb and items to market. So there is a combination of approaches here, but the expression and gesture, the warmth and the affection of the couple is very clear. By contrast, on the right, we have an altarpiece of St. Catherine by Bernardo Daddi, who seems to be clinging more to the Gothic and gold backgrounds of the medieval and Byzantine and Italo-Byzantine style. But still, the figures are placed firmly on a very firm shelf in space, and the throne, the means of torture of St. Catherine, the wheel, is almost transposed into being rather throne-like as for the Virgin Mary. Now, from about 1340 to 1400, there's rather a change in the artistic styles. Here we have an altarpiece by Andrea Orcagno in the Strozzi Chapel in Santa Maria Novella in Florence, dating from the early 1350s. And here it seems to mark a return to the rich gold, Gothic, Italo-Byzantine style, where Christ is depicted as a very austere God who is very, very much a powerful figure, rather than the more homely approach as we saw, for example, at Assisi. So this sort of more austere approach was actually the result of what I'm sure a lot of you know of as the terrible plague that swept Europe in the middle of the 1300s, from 1347 to 1352, and actually peaking at around 1348. The Black Death actually wiped out about 40% of the European population, and as well as affecting society and the economy and everything else, it had enormous psychological and spiritual effect on the populace, because it was thought at the time to be a punishment for sin, that the plague had been sent by God, this austere deity in the centre of this altarpiece, as a punishment for sin. And so it was the guilt of people, their own culpability, which had resulted in the Black Death, that was necessary. And so this led to a huge increase in piety. It led to giving donations to the church in the hope of securing life and salvation. And so this was one of the reactions to the Black Death in the mid-century, this turning to the church more and increased piety, and even the self-flagellation as people roam the countryside, trying to absolve themselves from sin. And the same feeling comes through in these examples of frescoes by Nardo di Cioni in the Strozzi Chapel, where on the right we have a depiction of paradise, which bears similarity to Giotto's version, where the saints and angels are all shown in ranks, up to the top with Mary and Christ at the top. Mary achieves a very great significance at this stage. You'll remember all the altarpieces showing Mary, the Maestas, the Madonnas, and she is almost here in this age of Mariolatry, almost on a level with Christ. But at the same time as this sort of joyful picture of paradise, the depiction of hell is very dramatic indeed. On the left, we can see Nardo di Cioni's depiction of hell, where we have the levels of hell correspond very closely to Dante's Inferno, as a reminder of good behaviour, which might avert things like disasters like the plague. But as well as this feeling of guilt and turning to the church because of these dreadful punishments, there was also the feeling of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die anyway. And so here in Traini's Triumph of Death, we've got a depiction of courtiers here who come across, who are celebrating and enjoying life, but then suddenly come across 3 dead people in coffins, again around the middle of the century, when the Black Death was getting hold and plague was so serious. So they're holding their noses, indicating the idea of smell, as well as the other senses that have been depicted in art up to this time, as they encounter this reminder that sin will end up being punished and that we all die anyway. So to sum up, we've got a time here of huge economic and social change, where Italy and the Italian states were developing extremely rich areas based on banking, merchants, the cloth trade, and using the wealth changing to more secular patronage, but at the same time change in religious thinking, the thoughts and ideas of St. Francis depicted again on the left of this slide, having a more humane approach to religion, and stylistically looking at Italy and the more northerly part and central parts of Italy that were being influenced by the Byzantine, Roman, and Gothic trends in art, as well as the true revival of the classical in art, looking at ancient sculpture and depiction in the round and so on. So lots of artistic trends and new ideas, but also underlying all this was, of course, the observation of nature, a more humanist approach, and a more scientific approach, whether that was in the depiction of trees and foliage, of birds, of figures that seem to have anatomy and bones beneath their draperies, or whether, as I've pointed out, some scientific ideas that link directly to optics, the development of the idea of perspective, or in astronomy, like Halley's Comet in Giotto's Nativity. So, what happened next? This proto-early Renaissance was so important. I've mentioned that the second half of the 14th century, Gothic and international Gothic remained, and it was really in 1400 that, with the competition for the baptistry doors, the work of Masaccio, Donatello and others, that the true flowering of the Renaissance occurs in the 15th century with the classical revival in arts, science and philosophy, which of course culminates in the High Renaissance in the 16th century in the work of Leonardo, Michelangelo and Raphael. So thank you very much indeed for listening.